Good evening, everyone, or afternoon. Welcome to, I guess we're in week number 5 now for PPA 500. So we are moving along very quickly in our semester together. We have tonight's class, then we have next week, the week after that, and then we'll see where we are with covering our information. And then that final Zoom session, we may be able to just use that evening for completing and submitting the final assessment. But we'll see how we progress. I think we probably have plenty of time over the next, including tonight, 3 class sessions to get through all the information that we usually cover here in PPA 500. Just as a really quick reminder, you have Canvas essay number 4, which is due next week on, I guess that's the 24th. For Canvas essay number 4, you'll be drawing upon the information that we are covering here tonight, looking at public administration as a discipline and kind of forming your own opinion about whether or not public administration constitutes a standalone, independent academic discipline, or if it is merely just a subfield within a larger discipline, such as something like political science. So that's Canvas essay number 4 due next week. And then also next week, you have the midterm assessment due, and we went through that in the first part of class last week. So you should be very familiar with the scenarios on there. As we talked about last week, it is truly an assessment. And so there's no real outside research that is required unless you want to conduct that outside research. Otherwise, your answers to those questions are all built upon the information that you have acquired here in this class in our time together. The answers, as we talked about last week on the assessment, should be parsimonious. They should be concise. And so usually 1 to 2 paragraphs for each one of those questions should be enough to adequately answer the questions. So that, as well as Canvas essay number 4, will then be due by midnight next Tuesday on February the 24th. So where I believe we left off last week after we had done our breakout rooms at the very end, of looking at, some of these differences between public and private sector organizations and the impact of privatization on the public sector and the public's ability to provide and produce goods and services. What we did last week is we essentially kind of laid the groundwork for why public organizations are different from private organizations. And as Graham Allison tells us, it's not in the functions that they do, it's not in the what they do, but rather it's in the how they carry out those functions. So, building upon that information tonight, we are going to talk a little bit more about this whole idea of the distinction between studying public administration versus studying private administration. And of course, where we go whenever we're looking for the genesis of a discipline of public administration is we do have to go back to Woodrow Wilson. And so you also have that Woodrow Wilson article assigned where Woodrow Wilson talks about the utility of separating out administration as a separate field of study, separate and apart from the study of politics like you would study in political science. Woodrow Wilson is typically seen as kind of being the father of the discipline of public administration. But before we really get into what Woodrow Wilson wrote about and how he kind of gave us the impetus for the creation of this discipline or field of study of public administration, I think it is important that we recognize some of the deficiencies in Woodrow Wilson that historians have shown us. And so as the years have gone on, and we've looked back at the life and the work of Woodrow Wilson, we do realize that Woodrow Wilson was a history professor. He also was president of a university. He also was president of the United States. But in his work as a history professor, Wilson was most notably interested in the study of Congress. And Wilson actually did a lot of work on Congress and how Congress acted and behaved without actually going and visiting Congress. And so he actually never went and visited Congress, but still became a renowned expert on Congress. We also know that he was very politically astute, which then allowed him to not only become president of Princeton University, but also become president of the United States. We also oftentimes credit Wilson with helping to further this idea of merit-based hiring and the creation of our civil service system at the federal level. And certainly, the creation of the civil service system was an important innovation whereby we're hiring people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, as opposed to hiring them based upon their party affiliation or based upon their status in society. So that was an important thing to do. However, historians have looked back at Wilson's motivations for doing so. And what a lot of historians will argue is that Wilson's primary motivation for civil service was not to try and make the civil service more efficient and effective as compared to partisanship, but rather it was a vehicle to try and promote segregation. We know that Woodrow Wilson has a very poor track record in terms of race relations and his perspectives on racial equity. And he kind of viewed this whole idea of reorganizing and redesigning federal employment as a vehicle to help segregate the federal bureaucracy. So I think it's important for us to look at Woodrow Wilson in that light. So we're not extolling his virtues as a human being in this class tonight, but what we are doing is recognizing the huge influence that his writings did have on the development of a separate study of public administration. And that influence really comes primarily from that article he wrote in 1887 called The Study of Administration. In his classic study of administration, he presents to us this idea, which was a relatively novel idea at that point in time, that if we studied administration as a neutral instrument separate from politics, what we could then do is a more efficient and effective way of doing the business of government. And he loved to refer to administration as being the quote unquote business of government. So he said we can pull politics out. We can then study this benign business of government, and then that will allow us to borrow innovations from other countries that will help make our administration of government much more efficient and much more effective. And that, as I think we all know, has come to be known as the politics administration dichotomy. Let me move a couple things around on my screen here. And let's close that down. Let's move this. Okay. What's come to be known as the politics administration dichotomy. The politics administration dichotomy, this idea by Wilson that it would be instructive for us to separate politics from administration and then study administration from the perspective of how can we make administration more efficient. In his article, Wilson made the argument that by 1887, the business of government, administration of government, had become so complex that it warranted its own independent study. Now, if we think about in 1887, and Wilson viewed administration of government as being complex in 1887, imagine what he would think about the administration of government today. But back then, he was saying it was complex enough that it warrants its own separate study. So the politics administration dichotomy, pull politics out of administration and study administration as its own kind of standalone area of study. That politics administration dichotomy that comes out of Wilson's article provides us with the foundation for what we currently know as a study of public administration. However, very early on, people started to realize that you really couldn't separate politics completely from administration. That administration here in the US operates and happens within a highly charged political environment. And so, since we really cannot separate the two, it's difficult for us to truly have a politics administration dichotomy. We start to learn that as early as the 1930s, writers such as John Gauss, G-A-U-S, was one of the first people to really criticize this idea of a separation between politics and administration. But whenever Wilson's article is taught, it's usually taught from the perspective of, well, Wilson created and advocated for a politics administration dichotomy. However, there is one passage and one line that's oftentimes overlooked in that article that you read. And that is a passage that says that politics are the touchstone of administration. When Wilson says politics serve as the touchstone of administration, What he is saying is that yes, we should study administration as a separate field because it's so complex, it deserves that isolated focus. But we always have to remember that administration is done in a political environment. So if we are borrowing innovations from other countries and applying them to our system of administration, we always have to modify those theories to make those theories better match our political culture. And so some examples that Wilson gives us in his article are along the lines of career civil service. So we did not create career civil service in the 1880s. And when Wilson wrote his article in 1887, it was 4 years removed from the passage of this thing known as the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act was what created career civil service. It was an act passed by Congress and signed by the president. So he was right fresh on the heels of the creation of career civil service in the federal bureaucracy. But when we created career civil service, we modeled it on the career civil service system that had already been existing for quite some time in England. So we borrowed vestiges and artifacts from the British civil service system and then brought them into the US and applied them to our system of federal employment. And he gives us a couple of examples. One example he gives us is the use of examinations. So if you're going to hire people, someone based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities, there must be some type of a vehicle for them to demonstrate those knowledge, skills, and abilities, what we call KSAs in modern hiring. And that vehicle would then be these exams. England, for many years in the British civil service system, had been using these examinations. However, the examinations used in England were closed examinations, a very closed system whereby only certain people qualified to sit for those examinations and demonstrate their expertise to then get a job in the British civil service. Well, Wilson made the argument that our political culture is a much more open political culture than what England had at the time. And so he argued when we bring these examinations in and use them in our system, we have to create a system of open examinations. So instead of using closed exams, we are going to use a system of open competitive examinations because, again, politics serve as a touchstone for administration. So we have to take these innovations and tailor them to fit our unique American political culture. Another example is in terms of, today we have these position classification systems. And if you want to enter into the public sector from the private sector, you oftentimes can do that laterally. And so if you are the head of a major corporation and you decide for whatever reason, altruistic reasons, or whatever the case may be, that you want to work for the public sector, you can move from your management leadership level in the private sector into a corollary leadership level in the federal civil service. You are allowed to do that type of lateral entry. In the English system in the 1880s, you were not able to do that. If you wanted to go from private to public sector, you had to go down to the very bottom of the position classification system and then work your way back up. So he argued, we'll take the position classification systems, we'll borrow that innovation from England, but we will make it lateral entry to again accommodate our more open political culture. So we study administration so we can borrow these innovations, but we always have to remember when we apply them to our country, we do have to modify them to make them match our unique political culture. So today, public administration scholars tend to reject this dichotomy, this separation between politics and administration. As we talked about last week, when we talked about differences and similarities between public and private organizations, we said one of the similarities between public and private organizations is that they are both involved in policy execution. So they're both involved in implementing policies. We also know that public sector organizations are more involved in policy formulation, but there is a direct, indirect role for those private organizations to also be involved. So administrators can be involved in both politics as well as administration. It's not a clear demarcation and dividing line between the two worlds. However, even though we know that public administrators are involved in politics in terms of policy formulation, We have to realize that their motivations at being involved in policy formulation may be different than the motivations of those elected officials who are involved in making policy. When elected officials are involved in making policy, one of their primary goals, as David Mayhew tells us, is to get reelected. So they're going to contribute to making this policy and design these policies in a way that will then help them get reelected. However, we as public administrators, we are not concerned about getting reelected. What we should be concerned about and motivated by is the making of good policy. So even though we're both, political politicians as well as public administrators are involved in making policies, our motivations for that involvement should hopefully be different from each other. So Wilson gives us this politics administration dichotomy. We know it's not a direct, complete dichotomy and separation, but at least gives us an argument for having a separate study of public administration. So we now have another justification for having a separate study of public administration. So let's talk a little bit more about this study of public administration and talk about some generalizations. And so if you read the chapter in the Kettle textbook, you know that Don Kettle talks a lot about some basic generalizations that we can make regarding the study of public administration. And he presents us with three different generalizations that I think are pretty good in nature. The first one he gives us is that public administration is timeless, yet it is also time bound. By being timeless, what he means is that there are some maxims and approaches to public administration that really stand the test of time. And so something such as the assumption that if you include your employees in an organization in the decision-making process, they are probably going to be more likely to then support the result of that decision-making process. So involving people leads to their support. We kind of have seen that over the years. It's kind of a timeless maxim of public administration. However, we also recognize that the theories that we have developed in public administration are actually very time-bound, in that our approaches are really artifacts of the time in which they were developed. So scientific management, as we'll talk about later tonight, as a classical public administration theory. Scientific management was developed in the early 1900s. It was developed at the time that you had a lot of unrest in a lot of our factory settings. And you had, Upton Sinclair and the jungle. And so the scientific management was supposed to bring some order to the way in which work was being done and work was being assigned within organizations. That is a product of its time. We'll talk also later tonight about schools of thought such as Human Resource Management School. The Human Resource Management School in the 1950s and the 1960s was again a product of its time. This is where we started to recognize the inherent value among our employees. And this is where we start to change our focus from managing personnel to managing human resources. Later on tonight, we'll also talk about a school called systems theory. And we'll recognize that systems theory, as it grew up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, really was the result of the recognition of all the different networks and all the different types of cooperation that goes on between public and private and nonprofit organizations, really trying to understand a public organization in terms of what role does it play in the larger system that surrounds it. So that was a product of its time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So public administration is timeless, yet it is also time-bound. The second generalization is one that I really like a lot. You know that my favorite answer to everything is it depends. Well, this one's kind of your it depends answer. Public administration is universal. We know it's ubiquitous. We've talked about how it touches every single aspect of our lives. However, it is also culture bound and will vary according to situation. So we have to take into account the context of the situation to understand how we are going to manage organizations. This is kind of similar to when we talked about accountability and ethics a few weeks ago. And we said one of the approaches to accountability and ethics is the recognition that every organization has its own culture. And so if you're going to have ethical adherence and set up a system for ethical adherence, that system must be tailored to the individual culture within those organizations. So since it's universal, we can develop theories, but we also have to remember that we have to take the culture and the situation into account. And then number three, public administration is complex, but is only intelligible by simplified modeling or a step-by-step combination of models. This argues that the world of public administration is certainly very complex, far more complex than it was back in 1887. So, to understand complex phenomena, what we need to do is develop theories and develop models. Theories, as we know, are postulations of relationships between abstract concepts. So you're going to postulate a relationship in this theory between two what we call constructs, which are abstract concepts that are relatively difficult to measure. But what we do is we develop those theories and then we distill those theories into research models. So we take, for instance, an abstract concept such as quality of life, and we then distill that into a variable that will be operational indicators of quality of life. So maybe quality of life is an index that is made up of, amount of this percentage of disposable income, made up of a person's feeling of what we call self-actualization, that they have achieved everything that they want to achieve in life. They've achieved their utmost potential. And so we'll have all these different indicators for this abstract construct known as quality of life. So since it is complex, we have to develop theories and then take those theories and distill them and make them more specific into these models that we can then go out there, collect data for, and then test those models to then test the relationship between our variables. Very similar to how we would do it in any type of social science research method setting. But before we move on, let's really focus in on that idea of complexity and the complexity inherent in public administration. Because this is really a very strong argument for public administration being its own separate, independent field of study or discipline. So we know that organizations, those systems are complex. Because of that complexity, we need to have a variety of different models that we develop to understand these complex phenomena and the relationship between all these complex variables. And we know because of this complexity, one single research model alone is not going to be sufficient to explain organizations. And this brings us back to this argument of necessary but not sufficient. So one single research model may be a part of the puzzle. It may be necessary for us to understand why organizations do what they do, but it is not solely sufficient to achieve that goal. So basically what this telling us is because public administration is so complex, we have to develop a myriad of different theories and models to understand these complex phenomena. So where does all this complexity come from in the public sector? Well, from a lot of different complicating factors. One source of this complexity will be all those interconnections that we have between policy formulation and execution. We've talked about many, many times tonight and in previous classes about the blurring of the lines between politics and administration. Administrators are on the policy formulation side, they're also on the policy implementation and execution side. That adds this complexity to understanding why administrators do what they do. The need for coordination. We have a lot of different organizations, a lot of different types of employees, and they are all implementing different types of policies and programs with different goals and objectives. That means you need to have a whole lot of coordination. And that need for coordination adds to the complexity of understanding these organizations. Also, as organizations get older, they become more institutionally rigid, they become more fractured and more fragmented. The more fragmentation you have with the creation of all these different units and divisions and sections will then require a lot more coordination to make sure all these units and divisions are working together to accomplish our stated goals and objectives. Relationships and power. Whenever we have all these different individuals and these different organizations that are working together in order to try and achieve goals and objectives, that means that we're going to have to understand the power distribution and the power relationships that go on in all these different interactions. So, as we had talked about when we talked about John Gaventa, sometimes power is being exercised in a relationship in a very overt manner, in that first phase of power. Sometimes it's a little bit more covert, in that it's being done through mobilization of bias and agenda setting. Sometimes it's even more hitting, and it's being done through a co-optation of opinions. So there's a lot of different types of power being exercised in all these different types of relationships. Again, adding complexity. Public administration, public organizations are also said to be floating in the seas of time, in that they are artifacts of the time in which they are existing. So you don't have to look any farther than the federal bureaucracy in the last year. So if you are a federal agency, say you are the Department of Education, over the last year, the time period in which you're operating has really presented a lot of challenges and a lot of changes for you. You went from being a department to being a still a department, but seeing a lot of your functions start to be eroded and taken away. A lot of employees being reduced in force due to a lot of layoffs. For the goal eventually in the administration to get rid of the Department of Education and devolve all of its functions to either other federal agencies or back down to state departments of education. This is an unusual and unique time for the Department of Education as compared to where it was in the seas of time 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. The variation in the structure of our organizations also has a big impact. Some of our organizations have a top-down decision-making structure. They have what we call this tall hierarchy, where you have one singular leader, and then as you move down the organization structure, you encounter more and more positions so that the plurality of positions in the organization are at the bottom of the organization. Decisions are made at the top, and they are then handed down the layers of the bureaucracy. On the other hand, we have some organizations that are much flatter types of hierarchies, and the decision making is done in a little bit more of a bottom up type of a strategy. A good example of bottom up decision making is a type of budgeting that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks called zero based budgeting. In zero based budgeting, budgeting decisions are made at the lowest level of the organization where those decisions are able to be made. So you look through your organization and you look at the lowest level in the organization chart that is able to make budgeting decisions, and that's where your budgeting process starts every year. It's a very bottom up type of a process. When decision making is bottom up and much more egalitarian in terms of who gets to participate in decision making, obviously that's going to have a big impact on the behavior and the structure of the organization as compared to if it's more top down type of decision making. The ubiquitous nature of information today also adds to that complexity. We've seen the rise of social media over the past couple of decades, and social media then provides us with a lot more information, but as we know, a lot of that information is unvetted information. Sometimes today we're seeing information being scrubbed from federal websites. As Kelly Janicek talked to us about when she talked about the university library, she told us that librarians are working very, very hard to try and archive that information before that information is lost forever. So not only do you have more information, more unvetted information you have to wade through today, but some of that credible vetted information that used to be there is no longer available to you. So it becomes very a complicated type of system for administrators to decide where they get their information from in order to make their hopefully rational decisions. Headquarters versus field offices. We know that some of our organizations are very centralized in one physical location. Some of our organizations are split up across field and regional offices across the entire country. Think Department of Agriculture and all those different ag field offices that you have in just about every state in the country, multiple in some states. So that's a very fragmented structure to the Department of Agriculture. That adds a lot of complexity to the work that is being done and how we study that work. The attempt relatively recently by Kash Patel to move FBI agents out of Washington, D.C. and close up the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. was an attempt to move more from a headquarters to more of a field type of an approach. I see a hand. Nathan, go ahead.
I just want to say an example of a federal agency that's completely dispersed and so by the nature of it is NASA. And NASA, although it's all its functions spread around, and one of the challenges of being a private agency and being at the whims of Congress for its funding, and that is why it's been piecemealed all throughout, especially the southern U.S., where you have a lot of the research and development here in Southern California, but then mission control is in Houston, Texas. Okay, Houston, we have a problem. All the missile testing is done, or a lot of the testing done in Birmingham, Alabama, because they had to get senators from Alabama to vote. They had to get Texas to vote. And for Florida, they got the launch pads in Florida. And so having a very dispersed system, but as you mentioned, increased complexity and then also costs as well. And having to move materials all throughout the southern continental United States is very expensive.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And you really do underline the whole idea of politics and how politics can have an impact upon where these services are being located. And it's kind of politics and it's also weather related. But yeah, you have to get those senators to sign off on these things. And so they're going to want to see it. Texas senators are going to see it in Texas at the Houston Space Center. Florida senators are going to want to see the Kennedy Space Center. And so there is that political component. And a lot of this complexity really contributed, according to a lot of the case studies that were done, really contributed to some of those failures in the Challenger disaster. And with the problems with the O-ring and not being able to recognize those problems and the lack of a free flow of communication, not just vertically in NASA, but also horizontally across all these different locations, really made it difficult to identify the actual O-ring problem. And perhaps if those communication flaws could have been rectified, you had a more seamless communication flow through all these disparate parts of NASA, maybe then the Challenger disaster may not have happened. And there's a really interesting body of the literature that really looks at that Challenger disaster in what was it, 1987, I think it was, and how that
86,
came
yeah.
about because of it. What's that?
I think it was 86. Yeah, it was interesting with
86, yeah.
that too, is and then learning about the null hypothesis, or when us look at the null hypothesis for the temperature, that they said, oh, well, there's only a slight chance that there could be something happening if the temperature drops below this zero, but there's a 0% chance of that ever happening if the temperature is above it. So, but they didn't kind of like look at it with that perspective amongst much of the pressure.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the case studies, what they'll do is they'll lay out kind of a flow chart of the decision-making process, who is involved, and then some of the flaws in the logic, like you're pointing out, to some of the flaws in the logic in that decision-making tree. It's really it's a fascinating case study. It certainly is a tragic one, but it is a fascinating case study for, how do we address some of these problems in communication in these types of organizations? How do we address some of the flaws in that decision-making tree as well? So that absolutely a perfect example. The values. We know we have more values that we rely upon here in public administration as compared to the private sector. We know that we not only try and emphasize effectiveness and efficiency, but also we try and emphasize things like represented bureaucracy, social equity, political responsiveness, protection of individual rights, and so on and so on. The more values you have, obviously, the more complex the work then it becomes. So, with all this complexity, it means that public administration is too complex to be explained by the abstract, as we mentioned before. So, when we develop theories, we have to then distill them down into models. And it also means we have to develop multiple theories and multiple research models in order to try and understand all the complexities of public administration. That is kind of a long-winded way of saying that if public administration needs to be studied through the development of all these different theories and all these different models because of its complexity, does that then suggest to us that public administration should then be its own separate academic discipline? And this is an important discussion because, as we know, there's no one singular answer to this. All you have to do is look at the different delivery models of how public administration education is delivered in different programs around the world. And we know that there are a lot of different arrangements. Some public administration programs are delivered in a standalone academic department. That's the way in which we do it here at Cal State Long Beach. We are Graduate Center for Public Policy, and even though we're called a graduate center, that's just something that's come to us, handed down over the years, back from the 1973 when it was first developed. We are really an academic department. So we are a separate academic department within the College of Health and Human Services. We are separate and distinct from political science. They're their own academic department. And not only are they their own academic department, but they're actually in a completely different college. They're in the College of Liberal Arts. And I'm not going to bore you with the history of our program and why we're in health and human services, but suffice to say that they got into the early 1980s, they recognized that the College of Public Administration, because it was its own college, that it was too small to exist on its own. And so therefore they were then given, the creators of the program were given the choice of going into the very large established College of Liberal Arts or go into a brand new college known as College of Health and Human Services. So they felt we will be a large fish in a small pond, so we'll go into health and human services. And today we know that health and human services has grown so exponentially that it's almost as large as the College of Liberal Arts. And so we went from in the early 1980s being the largest department within health and human services to now in terms of headcount, because we're only a graduate program, being one of the smallest in the entire college. So we are delivered with a independent academic department. But we also know a lot of other public administration programs are delivered within a department of political science. My PhD is in political science, and I went through a very classical political science program. And that political science program viewed public administration as being one of my four comprehensive examination areas. So my number one field was presidency, then Congress, public administration and policy, and then state and local government. So it's just one of four subfields. The um, the plurality is that there is a plurality of MPA programs that are delivered within departments of political science. So that's the most common arrangement, but it's not the majority arrangement. We also then see public administration programs that are delivered within colleges of business. When I was in grad school at Ohio State, public administration was a department within the larger College of Business. Now, fortunately, since then, they got a large influx of money from the former Senator John Glenn. And so they've been able to create a John Glenn School of Public Affairs. And so now they're in their own college or their own school outside of the College of Business. But oftentimes, public administration was kind of the afterthought in the College of Business. I had a economics professor who always said, if you want to know which car belongs to a business faculty versus public administration, just look out in the parking lot. And the Mercedes and the Jaguars, those belong to the College of Business faculty, and the AMC Pacers are the ones that belong to the public administration faculty. So that's another arrangement. We have some that are delivered within a Department of Health Administration. So they'll have Department of Health and Public Administration. So there are all kinds of different permutations of approaches to how to deliver public affairs education. So there is no one given answer. And so I'm not looking for you in your Canvas essay number 4 to say, well, this is it and this is the end of the story. I want to know what your opinion is. And I want you to develop your own opinion about whether public administration is its own academic discipline. And that really does matter. The answer to that question matters because if you believe it's its own academic discipline, you would deliver a program much like we do here in at Long Beach. If you believe it's part of political science, then you would be delivering it much more like my alma mater used to deliver it. So it really does have implications for how we do public affairs education. But before you can determine on your own whether or not public administration is an academic discipline, it really does beg the question of what is an academic discipline? We've got all kinds of disciplines across the university. We got history, we got physics, we got biology, we got chemistry, we have sociology, criminology, and so on and so on. So we've got all these different academic disciplines. But my question to you is what makes something an academic discipline? What are the characteristics of an academic discipline? Any ideas what makes an academic discipline? Jason, go ahead.
One of my few guesses would be like it having its own theories.
Yep, absolutely. And that's one of the major requirements is that they develop academic disciplines develop their own theories. They develop their own ways of measuring phenomena within their field. And the reason why they develop their own unique theories is that term uniqueness. Academic disciplines typically study unique phenomena and they then use their own unique methods for studying that phenomena. That's why their theories are unique. That's why their research models are unique. So, for an academic discipline, the argument goes to be a standalone academic discipline, there is a uniqueness to what you are studying, and there is a uniqueness to how you are studying those phenomena. So, you develop your own ground rules, you develop your own norms and expectations in terms of the type of information you collect, the way in which you analyze that information to then study the type of phenomena that you are focusing on. You think about the approaches used by history and compare that to the approaches used by political science. Well, the phenomena being studied in history is the past. You're looking at past events and so, in looking at those past events, you are going to be relying upon archival information, relying upon reports from the time, documents from the time. That's how you're going to do your history type of exploration. In political science, it oftentimes is a lot more contemporary in nature. And so we're going to collect our information from a variety of different methods. We're going to use sometimes archival research, but oftentimes we're going to use secondary data sets. We are going to use surveys. We may use interviews and focus groups. So that's our approach to how we collect information. Look in the field of psychology, most of their collection analysis of information will be done through a much more experimental type of process. And so you create experiments using human subjects. If you think about something like biology or chemistry, your experiments are going to be much more controlled because you're not running experiments on individual human beings. You're running experiments on animals, or you're running experiments on genetic testing or whatever, however you do it, it's going to be a much more controlled type of analysis of your data because your phenomena is much different than it would be in political science or it would be in history. So I think the major distinction really comes down to the uniqueness of what we are studying and the uniqueness of how we are studying it. That then leads you to the question, does the study of public administration demonstrate that amount of uniqueness to qualify as a separate academic discipline? We're not answering that here tonight. That is what you are going to answer for me in Canvas essay number 4. And there are no right or wrong answers to that. All I want you to do is tell me that you believe it's a discipline or you do not believe it's a discipline, and then give me some justification for why you arrived at that answer. I think that, in my graduate program, the vast majority of faculty really viewed public administration as a subfield, because they would argue that what we are studying is going on within governmental organizations. Governmental organizations are not only studied by public administration theorists, but also by political sciences. They would argue that politics and administration are so interwoven that it would make sense to study public administration and policy as part of the study of political science. However, there was a small minority of faculty, typically those people who taught public administration, they were the ones who really felt public administration was its own standalone academic discipline, but they were outvoted by the other members of the faculty. So think about that for Canvas essay number 4 and develop a justification for whether it is or is not a standalone academic discipline. And again, it's not just an esoteric argument, because how you feel in terms of public administration being a discipline or not will then fuel your approaches to how you not only study it, but then how you teach public administration. And so I think that there's actually some practical implications for how you view public administration as a standalone academic discipline. And that really does get us then at my favorite question of, well, so what? So you say it's an academic discipline. Well, what does that mean in terms of the way in which we deliver public affairs education? So think about that for Canvas essay number 4, and that will then fuel the work that you'll be doing then on Canvas essay number 4. Again, no right or wrong answers, just your opinion and then a justification of your opinion. But regardless of whether it is a standalone academic discipline or just a robust subfield within another academic discipline, we have over the years seen the development of multiple different theoretical perspectives on how to study public administration. And most of these theoretical perspectives are all built around the study of public organizations, because as we had talked about last week, public administration is the study of public bureaucracies. Public bureaucracies are public organizations. So at its very heart, we are still studying public organizations. So what I'd like to do at this point is to kind of walk you through a very cursory overview of the evolution of the theories and approaches in the study of public administration dating back to the late 1800s and then bringing it forward to modern times. Now, this is your overview of your core course PPA 660 organization theory. So as you move forward in the program, you will be required to take organization theory. And in organization theory, you will delve into a lot more details in terms of all these different theorists and all these different theories, and really kind of get into the granular details on all those theories, what they are and how they work. Clearly, as an introductory course, we are not doing that here tonight. We're just going to kind of from the helicopter perspective, the 30,000-foot level, kind of look down at the evolution of all these different schools of thought in public administration and kind of show you some similarities and differences between them and some of the through lines, some of the threads that really tie this entire 150 plus year evolution together. So the way we're going to approach it is we're going to talk about different schools of thought. The two major categories for these different schools of thought are the classical schools and then what we call the neoclassical schools. So the classical approaches and then the newer approaches, the neoclassical approaches. In the classical school, for our limited purposes here tonight, we're going to pull out and focus on 3 primary classical theorists. Max Weber, and that's a gentleman on the bottom left of your screen. Frederick Taylor, who is in the middle of your screen. And then the person with the very interesting and very impressive facial hair at the bottom right of the screen is Luther Gulick. So Max Weber, and it's called Max Weber. His name is Weber because he's German. So instead of Weber, it's Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, and Luther Gulick. So let's walk through these 3 different classical theorists and their approaches on how to study organizations and how we have taken their theories and modified them to apply them not just to private but also to public organizations. So Max Weber chronologically, we're going to do this chronologically with our evolution. So chronologically, Max Weber is the first one we start with because Max Weber was writing in the late 1800s. Max Weber, by academic training, he was a German sociologist, And he was really approaching this whole issue of studying organizations through the framework of structure. So Max Weber believed that if we could structure our organizations in what he calls the ideal bureaucracy, so the ideal bureaucratic structure, and we could structure all of our organizations in this ideal bureaucracy, that is what will allow us to make our organizations effective and efficient. So the first thing to know about Max Weber is that he really did focus very much on structure. The second thing to know about Max Weber is that he was a very big believer in bureaucracies. And we've talked about before how today there are a lot of negative associations that people have with the word bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is basically a dirty word for a lot of people today. For Max Weber, bureaucracy was not a dirty word. He felt that bureaucratic organizations were the utmost example of rationality. He was a very big believer in rational decision making. He said instead of just following a leader based on their charisma or just doing something because that's the way you've always done it in the past, you should make your decisions based upon empirical information that you have collected and you have analyzed, and then you render a decision based upon that empirical information you've collected and you have analyzed. That's rationality. And he felt that bureaucracies were kind of the apex of rationality. They were the pinnacle, if you will, of rational decision making. So he really did believe a lot in rationality. He felt, again, as I said, if we structure our organizations as these rational organizations, as these ideal bureaucracies, that will make us effective and efficient. The third important point about Max Weber is that he took what we refer to as a macro level approach to the study of organizations. He was very concerned about the ultimate goals of the organization itself. So for Max Weber, it wasn't about the individual employees. Individual employees were just kind of a means to the end. The end was achieving the goals of the organization, making the organization as effective and efficient as possible. And we can do that, we can achieve all those things through this ideal bureaucratic structure. So the ideal bureaucracy, according to Max Weber, has a tall hierarchy that we just mentioned previously, where you have this organization chart, you have one person at the top, and as you go down, you really have very much this pyramidal shape. As you go down the organization chart, you encounter more and more positions. It's a very much of a tall hierarchy. Decision making is located at the top, at the apex of that pyramid. And then those decisions are just handed down through the members of the bureaucracy. In this tall hierarchical organization, we also have an emphasis placed upon division of labor. So we're dividing up the work. There's a lot of work, complex work that these organizations have to do. So to get all the work done on a daily basis, we will divide up the work among our employees. As we divide the work up among our employees, every employee then specializes in a specific set of tasks. That is essentially today what would be in your position description. So in your position description, if you are a classification analyst, your specific set of tasks will be number one, to conduct classification and reclassification studies to classify positions for the purposes of compensation. That's what you are focusing on. You're not focusing on other operational aspects of the organization. You're not focusing on creating and managing budgets. You are focusing on classification and reclassification studies. You're specializing in those tasks. When individual employees specialize in tasks on a daily basis, they then become very adept at those tasks. They then become experts at doing those tasks, which means that our ideal bureaucracy will then be staffed with these experts. Also, within this ideal bureaucracy in this tall hierarchy, we have what's called a unity of command, a chain of command. So everyone knows to whom they are accountable. So they know where they sit in this organization chart. We also know that we have what he calls a span of control, so that managers in the organization are responsible for the actions and behaviors of a limited number of people located beneath them in the organization chart. So you're not responsible for all 1,000 people below you in the chart. You're responsible for a limited span of employees. So maybe you'll have one unit that's under your control or a couple of units under your control. So we limit your span of control to try to make it a little bit more realistic for a human being to be able to do that type of management. We also have an ideal bureaucratic organization that is staffed with professional and career employees. They are professionals in that they have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the tasks that they have been assigned on a daily basis, and they have a career orientation in that they view that they are in this organization for a career. So they don't think they're free agents. They're not going to jump from one organization to another every single year. They really view this as this is where they are and this is where they're going to stay. This is their career. So they're very closely aligned with the organization. And everything is written. Everything is based upon written documentation. So whenever we make a decision, we are basing it upon written documentation. So we have written rules and regulations and policies and procedures, and we adhere to those written rules and procedures. Now, obviously, the good thing about relying upon written documentation is that it allows us to protect individual rights. It allows us to treat people equally. The problem is it becomes red tape. So we have too much in the way of rules and regulations, too much written documentation. That's the red tape that people always bemoan when they talk about these inefficient public organizations. So this ideal bureaucratic structure is what Weber really wanted to see demonstrated by all organizations in order to be effective and efficient. So, in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of Max Weber's ideal bureaucracy theory, the advantages are that it's still with us today. Now, obviously, some of this has worked because today we have organizations, even modern organizations, that have organization charts. Most of those organization charts are very much tall hierarchical types of structures. We have these position descriptions where we have a specialization of task and division of labor. We assume that people are experts. We have a unity of command. So all these things are essentially still with us in our modern organizations. However, the problems with Max Weber's ideal bureaucracy are some of the reasons why we later on ended up developing these neoclassical theories. One of the things I told you, I'll show you some through lines, some threads that connect all of this evolution together. One of those through lines is that every time a new school of thought is developed, it is developed as a rejoinder or a response to the flaws in that previous school. So clearly, Weber's ideas had some flaws, which then spawned new schools of thought. If there were no flaws in ideal bureaucracy, then there would be no need for the development of new schools of thought and theories. So the problems with Weber's ideal bureaucracy, the primary problem is that it was a one-size-fits-all approach. So we're not taking into account the nuances of different organization cultures. We're just saying you do this, you put together an ideal bureaucracy, and that's going to work for every single organization, large or small, regardless of their functions. It's going to work for everyone. It also overlooked individual employees. So we really don't have a whole lot of talk here going on about the goals of the individual employees. It didn't have that micro approach. It was very much of a macro approach. What is in the best interest of the organization? But that is Max Weber. It's important to note that Max Weber was not what we would consider to be a homegrown public administration theorist. And part of that is because he was writing before Woodrow Wilson came up with this idea of having a separate study of administration. So he's not a public administration theorist. He is a theorist who we have taken his theories and we have modified them and applied them to the public sector. This is what makes public administration very multidisciplinary in nature, in that we borrow heavily from other disciplines, modify and tweak those theories, and then apply those modified theories to understand public organizations. But he's really our first classical theorist that we talk about, Max Weber and ideal bureaucracy. Then we'll fast forward very slowly into the early 1900s. And the second classical theorist we talk about here in this class is Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor is best known for his theory of scientific management. Frederick Taylor shared some similarities with Weber, but then had some differences as well. One of the similarities that Taylor shared with Weber was this macro level approach, that we are looking at how to make our organizations as efficient and as possible without paying a whole lot of attention to our individual employees. So he and Weber both shared a macro approach to studying organizations. They also shared a relatively dehumanizing approach to individual employees. Frederick Taylor was known to talk about employees and individual human beings as being boorish beasts. Not only were they boorish beasts, but they were also cogs in the machinery, meaning that our whole focus is to keep the machinery of the organization running efficiently. If you have a broken cog in the machine, so if you have all these cogs that are all turning and you know how cogs work, you can visualize it, that they all have these teeth on them. As a tooth of one cog pushes against the tooth of the other cog, it turns it, which then does the same to another cog, and so on and so on. And that's what makes the machinery work. If you have a cog that has a broken tooth, you take that cog, you throw it away, you discard it because it has no value to you anymore, and you get a new cog that has all of its teeth and you insert it into the machinery so the machinery will run efficiently. So people were disposable cogs within the organization's machinery. So a very dehumanizing view of individual employees, probably even more dehumanizing than what we had with Max Weber's ideal bureaucracy. Another difference between Max Weber and Frederick Taylor had to do with their area of focus. So Weber focused on the structure of the organization. And if we can structure our organization in this ideal way, that's what will make our organizations efficient and effective. Taylor says we want to focus instead on the work processes. So we want to look at the work that's being done within the organization and look at each job that's going on in the organization. And this is why he then did, where he developed his scientific management theory. He said what we need to do is analyze each individual job to understand what is working versus what is not working. We'll take all the parts of the job that are working, what he called the true movements, and we'll combine them all together, get rid of all the false movements, and then the combination of these true efficient movements will then make what he referred to as the one best way to do the job. So Frederick Taylor, in his scientific management, used these approaches known as a time motion study. Literally, you would have an analyst that would stand behind an employee doing a job with a stopwatch. And that analyst would time every single motion that that employee took in doing their job. So for shoveling pig ore, a very simple job, how much time for them to pick up their shovel, how much time for them to put the shovel in the cart of pig ore or the pile of pig ore, how long it took them to pick that shovelful up, how long it took them to take that shovelful over to the cart, dump the shovelful in the cart, and return to the original pile. Those are all different movements they were taking in the course of doing the job of shoveling pig ore. So we would time each of those movements, and then we would take all the movements that contribute to efficiency, combine them together into the one best way to do the job. Taylor felt that there is one best way to do every job in the organization. So Taylor focused on work processes through these time motion studies, whereas Weber focused on structure. But they were still both focusing on the one best way. For Weber, one best way to structure. For Taylor, one best way to do a job. Taylor's scientific management, again, it was an artifact of its time because, as we said, he was writing at a time where we had a lot of unrest in our factories, a lot of employee dissatisfaction, a lot of employee injuries and deaths. He thought we could rectify a lot of that with these time motion studies, which is what he calls scientific management. Also, when he was writing in the early 1900s, there was essentially a lack of middle management in a lot of our organizations. In that today we know we have this whole level of middle managers in between the leaders of the organization, upper level management, and our line employees. It wasn't like that when he was doing his writing. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to create this middle section of middle managers. And those middle managers were the ones that would then micromanage the operations and the behaviors of those individual employees to make sure those employees were doing the job in the one best way. If an employee was not doing their job in the one best way, you fired them, you got rid of them, you went out there and you hired someone who had the skills to come in and do it in the one best way. You trained them to do it in that one best way, and you then put them on the job and you then evaluate their performance on a daily basis. If, however, you had an employee that was doing a good job, was being productive and efficient, doing the job in the one best way, well, then you reward them and you compensate them. So remuneration was part of Taylor as well, that you compensate these employees for doing a good job. You compensate these middle managers if the employees under them were doing efficient work. But again, the big thing here makes him a classical theorist is that it was a one size fits all type of approach. What we say the search for a panacea. And you're familiar with panaceas. A panacea is a one approach, a singular approach that works in every single situation. So that's Frederick Taylor and his idea of scientific management. It's also important for us to know that Frederick Taylor also was not a public administration theorist. Frederick Taylor's scientific management was developed for and implemented by the private sector. So it's primarily a private sector set of approaches. In the 1920s, because it was being so successful in the private sector, at least thought to be so successful by corporations, public organizations started to adopt it. So again, here's an example of a multidisciplinary approach with public administration. One of our foundational theorists, Frederick Taylor, was not a homegrown public administration theorist. The primary advantages of Frederick Taylor is that we still see vestiges of Frederick Taylor in our organizations. So we still have these position descriptions where we have here are the jobs that you do and how you do those jobs. We have performance evaluation processes, which is how we kind of do this evaluation of how well people are performing. We still have position classification systems where we take the jobs that they are doing and the qualifications necessary and we use it to classify positions for the purpose of then compensating those positions. So all those basic elements that are vital to a civil service system, all those can certainly trace their antecedents back to Frederick Taylor and scientific management. So it has some pretty impressive staying power in that regard. However, the disadvantage is the dehumanizing nature, the impersonal approach to individual human employees. He didn't view inherent value among these individual employees. It's a very dehumanizing approach. And that is the problem that a lot of the neoclassical theorists, like human relations and human resource management theorists, would then pounce upon and use as a justification for developing their own theories and their own schools of thought. Then our third classical theorist is Luther Gulick. And with Luther Gulick, we're moving forward a bit. So we're moving into the primarily 1930s and 1940s. And Luther Gulick is part of a movement known as the Principal School. And when you go on and you take PPA 660, you'll talk about other principles theorists besides just Luther Gulick. You'll talk about people like Henri Fayolle. You'll talk about people like James Mooney. So there are a lot of others in this principal school. But we're going to focus on Luther Gulick because Luther Gulick is now, for the first time, someone we can really claim as somewhat of a homegrown public administration theorist. Luther Gulick was really the first person who was able to develop his theories and then apply them directly to public organizations. Luther Gulick was a leader on the Brownlow Commission. And in the 1930s, we had the creation of this Brownlow Commission. We know in the 1930s, we had the FDR administration. FDR had his New Deal. And in that New Deal, it consisted of creating all these different programs and all these different alphabet agencies to implement these programs to help pull the economy out of the Great Depression. But whenever you create all these programs and all these new federal agencies to manage these programs, you have exponentially exploded the size of the federal bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy became so big that it was literally impossible for one person, the president, to be able to manage this entire federal bureaucracy. So the Brownlow Commission was charged with the responsibility of coming up with recommendations to help make the federal bureaucracy easier for the president to manage. This was the opportunity for Luther Gulick to bring his principles approach into the reorganization plan for the federal government in the late 1930s. So he was able to take his theories and apply them directly to changing the federal bureaucracy. Gulick's principles theory really focused on creating a universal set of tools, if you will, or principles, that if we could teach all of our managers these universal principles, it would then equip them with a managerial toolkit that they could reach in that toolkit and pull out a tool and use it at an appropriate point in time. We've already introduced this idea of POSCORP when we were talking about the Graham Allison article. This is what Graham Allison referred to as the basic essential functions of organizations, regardless of whether you're in the public or in the private sector. So this really terrible acronym of planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. We've talked about each of those in turn last week, but when we talked about Graham Allison, but essentially what Gulick is doing is he's saying each one of these things will serve as a tool in the managerial toolkit, and every manager just needs this universal toolkit in order to be successful. And if managers successfully utilize these tools in the principles toolkit, that will then make them effective and efficient, which will in turn make their organizations effective and efficient. And again, there are others, Henri Fayol, James Mooney, who at the same time were developing very similar theories. And so in 660, you'll put them all together as principles theorists. We kind of group Gulick into the classical school here for our discussion because he still took that one size fits all approach. And that's that one unifying theme that overarches the entire classical school. One way to structure, one way to do work processes, one way to teach your managers in terms of these principles. But Luther Gulick, even though he was a very influential theorist for the restructuring of the federal bureaucracy, he also met with some criticisms. And two of the people who were highly critical of Luther Gulick were theorists by the name of Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo. Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo are two of the primary, again, a whole group of them, but two primary public administration theorists who wrote on a variety of topics. For Herb Simon, his problem with the principal school is he argued that these were not actually principles, but he argued they were much more proverbs. And it says, you think about a proverb is essentially a story. And for every good story, every good proverb, you can find another story, another proverb that pretty much cancels it out. So he says it's the same thing with these quote unquote principles. And that's why we have principles in quotation marks. They're really proverbs in that if you say, okay, well, I'm going to be doing planning, does that then cancel out your ability to do all these other things? Can you only do one of these things in exclusion? Are they mutually exclusive under the limitations of running a very busy organization with limited resources? Dwight Waldo kind of agreed with Herb Simon and said that the problem with these principles is that they were non-scientific. That Gulick kind of laid this out in a very scientific way, that these principles were developed scientifically, and if they're applied correctly in every situation, you'll always be effective and efficient. Waldo argued that they were not scientific, and instead they were very value laden, and that there were inherent values that were subsumed within these principles. And the value that was subsumed within the principles was what Waldo referred to as exploitation. He felt that these principles were all designed to enhance the power of management over employees and to give managers tools not to make their organizations efficient, but rather give them tools to exploit the labor of their employees. And he felt that was kind of the underlying subterfuge of this kind of anti-humanistic viewpoint that these were being used in order to try and manipulate and exploit the labor of employees. So Simon and Waldo's criticisms were relatively damning of not only Gulick, but the entire principles movement, and really, again, led to a lot of other theorists saying, well, there must be a better way. There must be a better way than Weber and Taylor's dehumanizing approach. There must be a better way than Gulick's exploitative approach. There must be another way instead of just this one size fits all type of an approach. And all those responses, all those rejoinders, then gave rise to what we refer to as the neoclassical theories. And the neoclassical theories then start to turn our attention more toward individual employees, especially in terms of human relations and human resource management, and start asking the question about individual employees, aren't they all different from each other? Don't they all have their own different wants, needs, and desires and their different motivations? And shouldn't we take those different wants, needs, and desires into account in order to make our organizations more effective and more efficient? So the first neoclassical school of thought is a school of human relations theory. And human relations theory, the three authors we'll talk about there are Mary Parker Follett, you see her there on the screen, and Chester Barnard, who is on the right-hand side of the screen, and then someone who is not pictured, which is Elton Mayo. Those are our three primary human relations theorists that we will then get to after the break. I think it's pretty a good time for us, and this is kind of, it's theoretical, so kind of I don't want to say esoteric, but it is very theoretical in nature, and so I think it's probably a good time to take a break. We'll take a break for until about 5:30. When we come back from 5:30, we'll start fresh with our neoclassical schools and start with human relations, human resource management, systems approach, and then some of our newer, more modern approaches. Once we get through with all of that, we will then reassess our time, see what we're doing on time, and then decide how we want to move forward from there. But it's important that we cover all this information here tonight on the theories because this is what will inform scenario number 5 on your midterm assessment. So, what we talked about with the discipline of public administration, the politics administration dichotomy, the Discipline of Public Administration information informs Canvas essay number 4. Politics Administration dichotomy will then inform scenario number 4 on the midterm assessment. And then this information we're talking about here tonight, the theoretical approaches, that will then be the information you use to answer scenario number 5 on the midterm. So that's why it's important we at least get through this information tonight. All the other information is for the final, and so that's something if we have to hold off until next week, we will do that. So that's enough of me talking for right now. Let's go ahead and take a break. Come on back at 5:30 and we'll pick up with neoclassical schools of thought. Okay, it is 5:30, so we're back from break and let's continue our evolution of the literature, or at least the theoretical approaches in the study of public administration by moving into our second broad category, which are neoclassical theories. And the first school within neoclassical theories is the school of human relations. Now, human relations is kind of an unusual one in that we have authors we're going to look at who are not necessarily contemporaries. So sometimes when you take the organization theory course, authors such as Mary Parker Follett will be referred to as pre-human relations theorists because she was actually writing before the other authors within human relations. Mary Parker Follett, as kind of a pre-human relations theorist, was writing primarily in the early 1900s and really most notably in the 1920s. Mary Parker Follett was writing in the 1920s at a point in time where scientific management was being adopted across the private as well as the public sector. So a lot of organizations were very much enamored with the idea of scientific management. Mary Parker Follett was really the only person who was willing to stand up and take issue with scientific management and all of its attendant flaws. I like to refer to Mary Parker Follett as kind of that voice in the wilderness. And that's one of the reasons why I really like Mary Parker Follett a lot. And I tend to cover her pretty heavily in my classes because I like theorists who are willing to kind of go against the status quo. And that's exactly what Mary Parker Follett was willing to do. Unfortunately for Mary Parker Follett, she was writing in the 1920s as a female. And so obviously a lot of the male authors at the time didn't really pay a lot of attention to Mary Parker Follett's ideas. But Mary Parker Fall, a lot of the ideas that she came up with in the early 1900s and the 1920s, those were ideas that were then developed by later human relations theorists in the 1940s and the 1950s. So she was really very much ahead of the curve in a lot of these criticisms that she was lodging against scientific management. And she was lodging these criticisms when it wasn't a good idea to do so because everyone was buying into scientific management. So that's one reason why I really like Mary Parker Follett. She's kind of a visionary in this regard. The second reason why I like Mary Parker Follett is that she envisioned the management of an organization in much the same way in which you would manage a democratic society. She made the argument that as we view our organizations, we need to view them as democratic organizations and view them kind of as mini democracies. She says when you look at a democracy, and we all have very, fond associations with the word democracy, and we've talked about in our basics of American government what a democracy is, and is predicated upon the participation of people in decision making. But she had a very fine view of democracies, and she said if we view our organizations as democracies, we have to recognize that those democratic organizations are going to suffer from the same flaws as a democratic form of government. So she said in a democracy, democracies suffer from two main flaws. The first flaw inherent in a democracy is the passivity of its citizens. The citizens tend to be very passive in the way in which they participate in a democracy. I think if you look at modern patterns of political participation, it really bears out what she is saying is true. The primary way that most people participate in their own governance is through voting. People tend to participate in voting because it's a very low cost endeavor, especially here in the state of California, where everyone gets a mail-in ballot. You can, fill out your ballot at home and just drop it in the mail, drop it in a vote box. If you want to go to a vote center, you can do that. If you want to drop it at a polling place. So it really gives you a lot of options. It's a very convenient and low cost way in order to participate. Voting is a much lower cost way to participate as compared to other forms of participation. Things such as running for elective office, things such as contributing to a campaign, campaigning for someone, doing those door knocks for people, all those things, going to city council meetings and town meetings. All of that requires more effort than just voting. So people tend to choose the path of least resistance when they participate in democracy. She says it tends to be the same type of thing in democratic organizations. And again, this is very much a utilitarian argument that people are rational, self-interested actors. As a rational, self-interested actor, you are going to select the course of action that presents the fewest costs and the greatest benefits. You'll do this kind of informal cost benefit analysis. Well, employees do the same type of thing within their organizations. So she says a democratic organization needs to combat this idea of passivity on the part of its employees, and you need to do that through providing them and incentivizing avenues for participating in decision making. That's a far different approach than we saw taken by Weber and Taylor and Gulick back in the classical school. She says the second fundamental flaw of a democracy is this idea of particularized interests. And this is what James Masson talked to us about in Federalist Paper number 10. You wrote about that in one of your Canvas essays. This idea of factions, that anytime you have a democracy, you're going to have different people and different groups of people that have different points of view. Those different points of view are going to come into conflict with each other. So anytime you have particularized interests, you're going to have conflict. She says a democratic organization is no different. So there will be inherent conflict that will occur in a democratic organization. So her argument is in running and managing these democratic organizations, we have to encourage people to participate, to get away from passivity, and we also have to have some avenues for dealing with and managing conflict when conflict inevitably occurs. So she says a democratic organization should deal with conflict in one specific way. So there are three different ways you can deal with conflict. She really favored that last one. So the first way is domination. One party wins, one party loses. That is the worst way to deal with conflict, according to Mary Parker Follett. The second way is through negotiated compromise. She argues that is better than domination, but it is still not the most appropriate approach because compromise means that both parties are going to give something up. And if both parties give something up, both parties will at least partly be disaffected and dissatisfied. So she says the third way and the most appropriate way to deal with conflict is through what she calls integration. Integration occurs as a result of a process she calls interpenetration. In interpenetration, you allow people to participate, you allow people to share ideas with each other, and then as people get together and share ideas, those ideas from one person will then interpenetrate into the thought process of another person. As the thought process of one person interpenetrates into the thought process of another person, then that other person starts to say, well, there's another way to look at this. And so through interpenetration, people will take all these different perspectives and all these different opinions, and they will integrate them all together into a new way of solving the problem and addressing the issue. And that's what she calls integration. The good thing about integration is because since everyone participated in putting together this new decision, this new approach, everyone has some skin in the game. Everyone has some buy-in into this new approach. And so people are going to be much more likely to support and implement this new approach, as opposed to if it was something that was just bestowed upon them through domination or a compromise settlement that they are not entirely happy with. But again, in order to get that point of integration, we have to encourage our employees to participate. We allow them to participate in making decisions about their own lives in the organization as well as the direction of the organization. And we then incentivize their participation. So if we need to give people time out of the day to participate with each other and have these types of discussions, then we give them the time throughout the day. Their ability to work with each other and engage in teamwork and be open to others' opinions. Those are all characteristics that we will look at in the performance evaluation process and reward in the performance evaluation process. So Follett argues that good democratic organizations will have an open vertical and horizontal communication system that allows people multiple avenues for participation. It's kind of similar to what Morton Grodzins characterizes our system of American federalism as when he talks about our marble cake system of federalism and the multiple avenues people have to participate in our system of federalism. Well, here in a democratic organization, employees have multiple avenues that they can pursue to participate in decision making. So Mary Parker Follett's idea, and there's a lot more to Mary Parker Follett, but for our purposes, to kind of contrast her to the classical school, she's talking about creating democratic organizations that value the opinions of employees and allow those employees to participate in decision making. So that really sets her very far apart from our classical school of a classical approach. However, there is one through line, one thread that connects Mary Parker Follett back to the classical theorists, and that is the ultimate goal. So, by having people participate in their own governance in these democratic organizations, you are not necessarily doing that to benefit the employee, but rather get the buy-in of the employee into these decisions to then benefit the organization. So Mary Parker Follett shares the macro level approach that we saw with the classical theorists, this approach of what is in the best interest of the organization. But at least what Mary Parker Follett has done is she's pulled us out of the classical approach and really shown us that we do have to engage with our employees and allow our employees to participate in the daily lives and the decision making within the organization. Then a second theorist that falls under the human relations school is Chester Barnard. And Chester Barnard approaches this whole idea from a kind of transactional relationship approach. In his very famous work, The Functions of the Executive, He made the argument that for a leader and manager to be effective, their effectiveness is based upon their ability to get the compliance on the part of their employees. So, as opposed to Weber and Taylor and even Gulick, who thought that you could just tell employees to do something and then expect them to do it, Chester Barnard realized that it's not always that easy. As we had talked about last week, we talked about some of the differences between public and private sector management. We focused on persuasion and how persuasion is a skill that public managers need to have, much more so in the public sector than in the private sector. Well, he makes the argument that through this persuasion, you enter into a transactional agreement with your employees. So you ask your employees to provide certain contributions toward organizational effectiveness. And then you incentivize those contributions by providing incentives that those employees place a value upon. So you use selective incentives to acquire the contributions from your employees to make your organizations efficient and effective. So, what the upshot of all this is that if you are going to provide incentives that will truly motivate employees, you have to know what your employees value. Employees will place a different value on different types of incentives. That's what's known in expectancy theory as valence levels. So every employee will have a different valence level for every possible incentive. And if they don't place a high valence level, a high value on, for instance, being recognized as Employee of the Week, then that's not going to serve as an incentive to extract the contributions you need from that employee. So you need to know the individual employees and their wants, needs, and desires. You also need to know the types of contributions you need to extract from your employees to make the organization efficient and effective. So there are a lot of different contributions that employees can give to their organizations. So they can give contributions such as their time, their effort, their loyalty, their expertise. Those are all contributions that you need to extract from your employees. And you need to know what contributions you need to extract from each individual employee, and then how to incentivize those employees to provide those contributions in this very transactional type of relationship. Barnard also talked a lot about what he called zones of indifference. So he says every employee will have a different zone of indifference. I know it sounds weird, different zone of indifference, but we'll say every employee has a unique zone of indifference. If you ask an employee to do something that violates their value system, that violates their norms and their ethical standards, they are going to push back very hard on that request, and chances are you are not going to get that employee's compliance. So what you try and do is ask employees to do things that do not violate their value system. Every employee has a zone of indifference, whereby they are relatively indifferent to the requests they're getting from their managers. And as long as you are not violating their values, you are operating within that employee's zone of indifference. So it's up to managers to know those zones of indifference for each individual employee, because those zones will vary from employee to employee, and then endeavor not to violate those zones of indifference. And then once you haven't violate those zones of indifference, then know what types of contributions you need from those employees, and then know how to incentivize those employees to provide those contributions. So for Barnard, it was all about balancing the incentives you're giving to employees with the contributions that you are extracting from those employees. If the contributions you get from your employees outweigh the dissatisfaction levels of your employees, you then have what Barnard refers to as an efficient organization. So he defined efficiency as if the contributions exceed the dissatisfaction of the employee, then you have efficiency in your organization. For Barnard, effectiveness was measured as how well the organization is achieving its stated goals. So again, for Barnard, just like for Follett and just like for the classical theorists, our focus is at the macro level on, at the end of the day, how can we achieve the goals of the organization? But the contribution of Barnard and why he's in this school of human relations theory is that he tells us each individual employee is different, and it's incumbent upon the manager to know and understand those differences. So no longer are people just identical cogs in the machinery. They are unique, different individuals, human beings who have their own set of wants, needs, and desires and value systems, and we have to communicate with them and understand those differences in order to make our organizations efficient and effective. So that's kind of Barnard's contribution to our understanding of how we study organizations. Then our third human relations theorist is Elton Mayo. And if you've done work in psychology, you're probably very familiar with Elton Mayo. Elton Mayo was very interested in the organization from a social perspective. So the classical theorists didn't care a bit about the social system within an organization. That didn't matter whatsoever to them. However, for Mayo, he's very concerned about viewing the organization as a social system, a social environment. So Elton Mayo and his colleagues, being good social science researchers, went out there and conducted a series of experiments. And we won't go through them all, but the one that we're most interested in for our purposes tonight will be the Hawthorne experiments. If you're familiar with the Hawthorne experiments, Elton and his colleagues went to the Hawthorne electrical plant. And what they wanted to see is they wanted to see what types of causal factors are associated with increased levels of productivity. So a very simple starting point for them was let's change a physical stimulus and see how that physical stimulus then affects productivity levels. So the physical stimulus that they wanted to change was the lighting level. So the first hypothesis is if we increase the lighting level, productivity levels will increase as well. Very basic notion that people can see better, they will become more productive. So they turned the lighting level up, and not surprisingly, the productivity levels went up as well. So they say, well, then our second hypothesis is just the opposite of that. So if we decrease the lighting level, then productivity levels should go down. They decrease the lighting level and productivity levels continue to go up. And those productivity levels actually increase higher than when they had increased the lighting level. So it wasn't the lighting level that was leading to higher productivity levels, but rather it was the recognition of these individuals in a social way. That you had these researchers who were in the Hawthorne electrical plant. They were talking to these employees. They were asking them about their daily work. They were asking them about their experiences, the types of things they wanted to get out of their job. They were paying attention to them in a social way. And it was that fact that the researchers were paying attention to these employees that actually was the strong causal factor that contributed to their productivity levels going up. Also, they recognized that when they put people in groups, the productivity levels of groups were higher than the productivity levels of the individual employees working on their own. Now, naturally, you would assume that if you get a group of people together, the collective of all their skills and abilities of a group should be greater than the skills and abilities of one individual. So you would expect that. But what they actually found is that the group performance was so much higher because of this pressure that if one member of the group was not pulling their weight, it was making the rest of the group look bad. So the rest of the group would put pressure on that individual to work harder. So everyone in the group looked better. Again, the bottom line here is he recognized that organizations are social environments and that individuals are social creatures. We have to pay attention to their social needs and understand that they're interacting with each other in this larger social environment. So it's not just about the technicality of doing the job, it's the social aspects as well. That is another great departure from the classical school because we didn't have a whole lot of discussion of social aspects in Weber, Taylor, or Gulick, but here we have the recognition of the importance of the organization as a social environment, a social subsystem. So those are three of the most prominent authors in the School of Human Relations. Again, Mary Parker Follett was writing much earlier than the other two. She was writing in the 1920s. The remainder of the human relations theorists tend to be writing in the 40s into the 50s, but that's the School of Human Relations theory. It is a response and a criticism to the impersonal, dehumanizing approach of the classical school, but what it shares in common is the macro level view of what is in the best interest of the organization. Where we start to get away from that macro level view and we stop asking the question of what is in the best interest of the organization and we start asking what is in the best interest of employees, that's when we transition from the human relations school into the human resource management school. And here we're talking starting in the 1950s and working all the way up. You can make the argument that it's still alive and well today. Human resource management theorists would argue that the relationship between the employee and the organization is not a one-way street, but rather it's a two-way street. So it's kind of like to take the John F. Kennedy phrase of ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Here it's ask not what the individual can do for the organization, but ask also what can the organization do for the employee. So now it becomes this two-way responsibility. Not only employees giving back to the organization, but the organization giving back to the employee. And the fundamental idea in human resource management theory is that the ultimate goal is to develop employees as human resources, to provide them with the ability to enhance their skills and to develop as human beings, irrespective of necessarily what they're giving back to the organization. Hopefully, in an ideal world, by developing them as human resources, they will give positive things back to the organization, but that's not the end goal. It can be just as important to develop someone as a human resource, and then even if they leave the organization, you have at least had a added value of helping that person develop as a human resource. And them developing and growing is a goal in and of itself. So this is a great departure from the theories that we have talked about up to this point in time. So again, when you get into 660, you're going to talk about more than just these authors in human resource management, but the three main authors we focus on in our limited time here in this class, Abraham Maslow, Douglas McGregor, and Chris Argyris. Now, as we have seen, we have borrowed from other disciplines. And so we said that Elton Mayo, we're borrowing more, psychological types of elements from him. Frederick Taylor, we borrow from the business world. We borrow from sociology for Max Weber. So we borrow liberally from other disciplines. Here with Abraham Maslow, we are also again borrowing from the world of psychology. So you've probably heard about Abraham Maslow before, and you've probably studied him, and you're very familiar with his hierarchy of needs that you see on the screen. According to Maslow, there are 5 needs that people have. At the bottom level, you have physiological needs. And so everyone has these physiological needs of things such as food and shelter, clothing, water. Those are your physiological needs that you need to survive. People are motivated by a deficiency in those physiological needs. So if you don't have enough food, you don't have enough water, you are motivated to go out there and acquire more food and more water. So that's a deficiency type of need. Then you also have safety needs. People always need to feel safe and secure from harm and threat. That is, again, a deficiency motivated need in that you are motivated by having a deficiency. So if you do not feel that you are safe and secure, you're motivated to become safe and secure. Next level up, you have belonging needs. And this is kind of more of a psychological type of need. Belonging needs, everyone needs to feel they belong to something, a family, a larger group of friends, an organization. So they are motivated by this need to feel that they belong to something. Esteem needs is the 4th level of needs. Again, very much a psychological type of need. Esteem need, everyone feels that they need to be held in high esteem by people who they respect. So those 4 needs, esteem needs, belonging needs, safety needs, physiological needs, those are all what are called your deficiency needs. So people are motivated by having a deficiency in those needs. That's what motivates people to work harder and make contributions. At the apex of the hierarchy of needs is self-actualization. Self-actualization is really a being or a growth need. So people always feel the need to grow. They always feel the need to self-actualize. And self-actualize means attaining your utmost potential, being all that you can be, as the U.S. Army used to say in their commercials. That's self-actualization. That is a growth need, which means it is ongoing. So for the deficiency needs, once you have remedied that deficiency, that need then ceases to be a motivator. However, for self actualization, that is an ongoing growth need. We never fully self actualize. We are always being pushed to try and grow and become better individuals, better human beings. So he says that is the growth need that organizations really need to focus on because that's the one that is ongoing, that people will always be motivated by this growth need of self actualization. Now, a caveat here with Abraham Maslow is that this is his classic approach to the hierarchy of needs. And this is the one that he wrote about and talked a lot about for most of his career. At the end of his career in his life, he went back and revisited this hierarchy of needs and made some changes. One of the most important changes that he made is he revised that self actualization top part of the pyramid and he changed self actualization to more of a need to give back to others and to kind of leave a legacy for yourself and to leave your community a better place than you found it. So he would argue that self actualization isn't really just about the self, but it's really about how you were viewed by others in terms of once you are gone, did you give back? Did you contribute to those around you, to the larger society writ large? So it's not just about the individual, it's about how well they can give back to society. So it's a little bit more of a altruistic type of an approach that he took later in life and later in his career. But it doesn't change the importance of the hierarchy of needs for our discussion here. Every individual has a hierarchy of needs, and that hierarchy may differ between individuals. So, for some people, esteem needs would be more important than belonging needs. And so, those levels can shift depending upon an individual orientation, which again underscores Barnard's point, which is we need to know our individual employees and manage them accordingly. So, we really have this recognition that people are not just replaceable cogs, and the organization needs to try and help people fulfill this growth need, this self actualization, and that's one of the jobs of the organization. So the organization has to give back to the employee. Douglas McGregor, who is very much of a management based theorist, he believed a lot in Abraham Maslow. He liked his hierarchy of needs, and he took Abraham Maslow's theories and he used them to create what he became very famous for, which was the dichotomy of theory X versus theory Y. And if you've taken a public administration before, you're familiar with it, or a management classes. A theory X approach to individuals is a very negative, very poor view of individual human nature. The theory X approach says that individuals are lazy, that they are not very intelligent, they're not very motivated, they are not very creative or innovative, that they don't like to work and they would rather engage in leisure than to engage in any type of work or activity. It's a very negative view of individual human nature, and that's what they called theory X. The opposite of theory X is theory Y. People are motivated, they are intelligent, they are creative, they are innovative. For a theory Y employee, work is as natural as leisure and play. So it's a very positive view of individuals. Well, so what? My favorite question. The so what is that he argued that the majority of our employees in organizations are theory Y employees, but they are shoehorned into a classical theory X organization. So when you take a theory Y employee and you try and squeeze them into a classic theory X organization, obviously it doesn't work very well. They are, dissatisfied, they're unmotivated because the organization is not giving them opportunities to grow, not giving them opportunities to move into supervisory positions, not giving them the ability to be innovative and creative. So it's a mismatch between Theory Y employees and a Theory X organization. So McGregor says what we need to do as we study our organizations is find a way to take a classical Theory X organization and transform it into a Theory Y organization to match the Theory Y orientation of our employees. So he gives us different strategies for doing it, which are kind of beyond our scope here tonight, but I'll just pull out one of them. One strategy for transforming a Theory X to a Theory Y organization is a strategy known as job enrichment. And job enrichment is the process whereby you allow an employee to participate in the redesign of their job description of their job duties. And you allow them to participate so that they can help design a job that will allow them to achieve their goals and fulfill their promise, and essentially what Maslow would call self-actualize. So, for instance, if you have an employee who's working in your organization, your city, and that's someone who aspires to be a future city manager, then they'll need to understand what all the different departments in the city do. So you design into their position the opportunity to float between different departments so that they can see what each department within the city does to then give them the perspective they need to eventually in the future become a city manager. You allow them to identify those things and put those things into their job description. You are then enriching their job to then help them develop as human resources. A student of Douglas McGregor is the third individual listed on the screen, and that is Chris Ardress. Chris Ardress was a direct student of Douglas McGregor and took McGregor's theory to then develop his own theory known as the theory of personal growth. So Ardress argues that people are not just either theory Y or theory X, that people mature and they develop over time. And so people who start theory X can certainly develop into more of a theory Y type of orientation. And Ardress argues it is the job of the organization to help that individual through their personal growth process, help them through this maturation process. And so they can do this through a variety of ways. They can, again, do job enrichment. They can do things such as training people for these superordinate positions. Ardress argues that as people age, they go through this maturation process where they aspire to supervisory positions, or what we call superordinate positions. They also become much more connected to the community around them. They tend to take on a much longer time perspective. So they're not just concerned about what's going to happen tomorrow or next week. They're concerned about what may happen 5 or 10 or 15 years down the road. They become very interested in helping other employees, especially younger employees, develop their skills so that they will have the skills to move into these leadership positions in the future. And so it's up to the organization to help those employees go through their personal growth trajectory. And so again, what we're looking at here with McGregor and Ardress, as well as Maslow, is looking at how can the organization contribute to the development of individual employees. And that's really what differentiates the human resource management school from the human relations school. Because now it's not just about the macro level of what's good for the organization, but now it also is a focus on the micro level, what is beneficial and helpful for individual employees. And if what benefits an individual employee does not directly and immediately benefit the organization, that is still acceptable under the human resource management approach. I recently saw a commercial for a big box retailer, and they will remain nameless because I don't want to advertise anybody, but it was a big box retailer. And that big box retailer had a recruitment commercial. And they had employees on there talking about, this company paid for tuition reimbursement for me to go back to college and to get my degree. And they didn't care if I stayed there. And actually, 6 months later, I moved into a supervisory position at another company. And that was fine with this big box retailer because it wasn't just about what I could give back to the company, but was how the company could help me in my development and my growth. And so there are some large organizations that really do buy in to this human resource management type of an approach. This is one of the reasons that human resource management is so prevalent across our modern day organizations. This is one of the reasons why we don't have personnel offices anymore. We have offices of human resource management because it really is incumbent on the organization to try and help the employee through their self-actualization growth process. But up to this point in time, we have talked about the classical theorists that looked inside the organization. We've talked about neoclassical theorists such as human relations and human resource management theorists that also looked inside the organization. But by the 1960s and 70s and into today, we have recognized that it is relatively unusual to have one singular public organization that's responsible for delivering public programs. That really what we have is public programs being delivered by a network of different organizations. And so public administration scholars have realized that we also need to look at the surrounding system and understand organizations not in exclusion, but understand them as parts of a bigger whole. So, what role does this organization play in its bigger environment, its bigger system? And that has spawned the school of thought known as systems theory. Again, we don't have a lot of time to go into the details here, but we will talk about systems theory, or you will talk about with your organization theory professor when you get to 660. But as systems theory has developed, there are basically two different branches of systems theory. There's the closed or natural systems branch, and then there's the open systems branch. And so in the closed natural systems branch, those theorists view the study of organizations as looking within the organization to understand how the organization itself changes its internal environment and changes its internal operations to come into balance with its external environment. So, a lot of these closed systems theorists are also referred to as natural systems theorists because they view organisms as akin to organizations as akin to living, breathing organisms. So, a living organism, from the moment that organism is born, that organism's primary job is survival. And so it will try to survive by regulating its internal processes to match its environment. And so, whenever you go to the doctor and you have your blood pressure measured, and you have your pulse rate measured and your pulse ox level measured, if everything is normal and everything is in balance and you're devoid of disease, then we would say that that living organism has achieved a point of what's called homeostasis. And homeostasis, I'll put this all in text as we go, but homeostasis is kind of that steady state, that balance internally to the organization, where the organization is at balance internally, and that internal balance is then within balance with the external environment as well. As a human being, if you get really, really hot, you start sweating. That is a natural response to that overheated environment. It helps you regulate your internal body temperature. They really viewed organizations in a similar type of manner. So the goal of every organization is to reach this point of homeostasis, kind of this point of organizational harmony, a lot of theorists would call it. And when you're in that point of organizational harmony, you've achieved the steady state of homeostasis. That homeostasis, that balance, will then allow you to then survive longer. But eventually, just like any living organisms, organizations also have to die and go out of existence. As organizations age, just like living organisms, they go through a process known as entropy. Entropy is the process of dissipating energy out into the external environment. So, as organisms dissipate energy into the external environment, eventually they will have lost so much energy that they no longer have the energy to be able to survive and they go out of existence. Same type of thing with organizations. As they dissipate resources out into the environment, eventually they will not have sufficient resources in order to survive, and that's when the organization goes out of existence. That's a process known as entropy. And natural systems theorists will argue that is a natural process of aging for any organization. So that's one branch of systems theory, and one way we can understand organizations looking at the internal regulatory processes within the organization. But the second branch is the one that I think is far more appropriate for our study of public organizations, and that is the open systems approach. In the open systems approach, we are interested in the interaction between the organization and its external environment. So we are interested in how the organization affects its environment and how the external environment affects the organization. Here, this idea of entropy this idea of dissipating resources into the environment, is still there, but there's also a process known as negative entropy, where organizations can then import new vital resources into the organization, and that's what helps these organizations survive through the future. We have some organizations that have been around for well over 200 years. We have think about the Department of Treasury, you think about the Department of State. Those have been around over 200 years. They have not gone out of existence, and they don't really show much of an indicator of going out of existence. This really kind of supports the open systems theory that yes, they will dissipate energy and resources into the environment in that 200 plus year period of time, but they will also import new energies in through negative entropy. They will hire people from the external environment who will bring new skill sets and new orientations and thought processes into the organization. They will bring in more resources, more money through appropriations or through grants that will help the organization survive in the future. They will cultivate relationships with client groups and constituents to develop their support, and that support will then help them survive. They'll cultivate relationships with policymakers, elected officials, and the support from those policymakers will then help the organization survive. So I really do like open systems theory because I think it does explain why a lot of our government organizations don't go out of existence. They don't die because they're able to import these new resources and this new energy. But just like the closed natural systems theorists, open systems theorists argue that it's the goal of every organization to find this point of homeostasis. But the point of homeostasis for open systems theorists is the balance between the organization and its environment. And when the organization is in a balanced harmony with the external environment, that's what helps the organization survive into the future. They also point out to us, and this is your 25-cent word of the night, is that there are multiple paths that organizations can take to achieve this point of homeostasis, this balance with the environment. And the fact that there are multiple paths you can pursue is a term in the literature known as equifinality. And equifinality just means there are multiple paths to achieve your point of homeostasis. So it really does also introduce to us the whole idea of it depends. If there are multiple paths that organizations can pursue, some paths make sense for some organizations, some don't make sense for other organizations. So again, it's kind of this death of the one size fits all approach to organization theory. And that is one of the through lines that really has characterized the entire evolution of our study of organizations is the slow erosion and decay of the idea of a panacea or a one size fits all approach. Now we understand there cannot be one theory that applies in every single situation because of the complexity of public organizations. We have to take into account individual organization cultures, the environment, all these types of relationships. It's a very complex approach. And so it's really very much, it depends. To understand how to better match our organizations, we have to take the context of the situation into account. But taken together, that's the school known as systems theory. And again, systems theory is very much alive and well today because we understand we have all these governing networks and organizations have to interact with actors and entities in their external environment in order to get their work done on a daily basis. And then one other modern approach that we cover in this class that you'll also cover in 660 that we already talked about in previous class sessions is the school of organization culture. Organization culture, coming to us from authors such as Sheen, makes the argument that every organization has its own unique culture. We're all familiar with the term culture. We know that societies have cultures as well as organizations. Cultures are essentially a set of shared expectations, norms, values. These are things that we all share as members of this organization or members of society. So, if we have this shared set of values, that is the culture that we all share. So, just like societies have cultures, organizations have cultures as well. So we study organizations through the lens of the culture of that organization. And each organization has its own unique culture. The way in which we study organizations in this school of organization culture is very similar to how we would study ancient societies going on an archaeological dig. So we dig up what we call artifacts. So for archaeologists, artifacts could be eating utensils. For organization culture theorists, artifacts would be things such as policy and procedure manuals. Could be things such as a meeting minutes and agendas from meetings. Those are all tangible documentation that we can get our hands on and we can analyze as theorists to understand the daily operations and the culture of that organization. So artifacts are very easy to obtain and they're very easy to study. But there is a second, more hidden level of organization culture known as espoused values. Espoused values are the values of the organization that the organization tells you about. So if you go and look at like we did in our first night of class when we talked about the values that underpin the MPA program, and where I listed out for you, I think we had like 6 or 7 values. That's us giving our espoused values. We are telling you here are the things that we value as an organization. Again, it's relatively visible. The organization's telling you this is what they are valuing, and you can study those espoused values. The third and the deeper level are what we call the basic assumptions. Basic assumptions are agreements that people kind of hold about how people should behave. And so, assumptions about how you will treat your fellow employee. We all kind of know that we are going to treat each other with collegiality and with civility. However, we don't go out there and talk about it a lot. It's just an assumption that we all share as members of the organization. Those basic assumptions, because they are not espoused, they are not spoken, they are not written, those are much more difficult to study when we study the organization's culture. So, to actually get at those basic assumptions, we have to actually go into the organization and interview members of the organization and actually find out what those assumptions are because those assumptions live in the heads of the individual employees in that organization. So that's a much more difficult way for us to measure organization culture. We also know that cultures can sometimes develop organically just over time, but oftentimes cultures are embedded into an organization by leaders. So a new leader comes into the organization and they can then use different strategies to embed the culture they want into that organization. So very simple embedding strategies can be things such like a leader will bring a new slogan into the organization. So together we achieve more is a slogan that a superintendent brought into my district when we hired her several years ago. That slogan, Together We Do More, then started appearing on the signature lines of all emails. It started appearing on the letterhead of all correspondence from the district. And by having that slogan, it kind of expresses to the individual employees, this is kind of what we value as an organization. We value working together. As Brian says, make America great again. And when Ronald Reagan first, in his campaign back in the 80s, first came up with that slogan. And remember, that was something that was created by the Reagan administration and is now being used by the Trump administration. That's an excellent example of that slogan. And the slogan kind of, we see a lot of slogans used, especially in political campaigns. Uh, so slogans are a very easy way to do it. Another way that leaders can embed cultures in the organization is by making it clear what they are rewarding and penalizing. And so when employees look at, well, this is a behavior that's being rewarded, then that is something that I should probably be doing because that's something that aligns with what the organization wants. If it's something that's being penalized, then obviously that's something that I need to try and avoid. So what you reward and what you penalize as a leader can embed culture. And I won't go through them all, but another interesting one, two more interesting ones. Another one is how the leader responds to a crisis can also embed culture. So if the leader has a very measured, a very calculated response to a crisis where they are not panicking, then the rest of the organization takes the cue not to panic either. So you're embedding culture into the organization. One of my other favorite ones is the use of physical space. How you use physical space within the organization can also give cues to employees about the culture, the expectations of the organization. So if you have a physical location where all your employees are working in individual cubicles. And those cubicles have those walls that are, yay feet high, and everyone's just working on their own and really don't interact with each other. That embeds that culture. And that's a very unitary type of approach to work. However, like we did, is we took our finance department and we redesigned the physical space to make it much more approachable for group work. And so now people have shared workspaces and they're encouraged to work in those shared workspaces. That is embedding that culture of teamwork and working together to achieve the same or similar goals. So those are just some examples of how leaders are able to embed culture into their organization. But for our purposes tonight, organization culture is a very prominent modern theory that is used a lot in studying public organizations, recognizing that it really does depend upon the individual organization and where that organization is located and the point in time in which that organization exists. Yeah, we could go on and on. As I said, you'll get an entire class on organization theory. But all I really want to do is walk you through a really brief overview of the evolution of these theoretical perspectives that have been developed on the study of public administration. So by looking at this evolution, we have seen that yes, indeed, we do have theories and models that we are using to try and understand the phenomena that we study in public administration. The question is the phenomena unique enough? And are those models and theories unique enough to then qualify public administration as its own standalone academic discipline? And that is the question you are going to wrestle with then for Canvas essay number 4 that is due by midnight next Tuesday. But again, this is just a very brief overview. You'll put a lot more flesh on the bones, if you will, once you get to your 660 course and talk about a lot of different other theorists. But the overall thread that ties all of this together is that we no longer have one way to measure our organizations. We have multiple ways, and we need to understand what the appropriate method is for the specific situation that we are studying. It's a much more complicated way of studying organizations, but I think it is far more accurate and reasonable than the way in which we study organizations back in the classical school. So that then covers all the information that will be covered on the midterm assessment. So you now have all the information you need to respond to all 5 of those scenarios. We are not going to do our group exercise, obviously, tonight because it's already almost 6:30, so we'll just pass on that for this evening. But do you have any questions about or clarification needed on any of the information we've covered tonight about either public administration as a discipline or field of study or these theoretical approaches to public administration? So what we will have through the remainder of our weeks together is we've already started it. We're basically looking at the functions of public administration. So when you look at organization theory, we're looking at how we study how to effectively and efficiently lead and manage our organizations. And that is one of the primary jobs of a public administrator is to lead and manage public organizations. And so that's kind of the first function that we covered here tonight. We just finished up with. Then when we get together next week, we're going to move into some other functions of public administration or public administrators. Next week, we will start with a discussion of the role of public administrators in the policy formulation, implementation, evaluation process, as well as the public program evaluation implementation process. So we'll talk about what public administrators do with public policies and programs. That will then give you your foreshadowing of 670 policy analysis and 696 research methods / program evaluation. From there, we will then move into a discussion of public employment and talk about the function of managing human resources. That will then give you an insight into how we manage human resources in PPA 577. And then we'll talk about managing fiscal resources as the final topic we cover in the course. And that will then give you insight into PPA 555, public budgeting and finance. So over the next couple of weeks, we will cover all 4 of those remaining core content areas to at least give you a little bit of a leg up so that when you do and go and take those courses, a lot of the information you cover in those courses, you at least have had an introduction to here in PPA 500. As you are having fun working through the midterm assessment, feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email if you have any questions at all about clarifications for any of those scenarios. But again, midterm assessments due next Tuesday, as well as Canvas essay number 4. I will get this recording up there on our Canvas site by tomorrow morning. And again, I'm available for any questions via email, so feel free to email me. Otherwise, thank you for being here tonight. I know we were missing a few people, but thanks for being here. I hope you have a really great week and try and stay dry with all the rain we're having. And then I'll talk to you again next Tuesday. Take care, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Professor.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
guys. Thanks.
Have a good evening.